All right, and we are live. Hello, everybody. This is AW, and we are continuing our reading of Fascism as a Mass Movement, which we left off last time. So I'm here with my good friend Tree and Hyperion, and we'll just get to it. Now, can you tweet that, Hyperion, that link?
Yeah, sure.
Anyways, let's get to it. This is continuing straight from where we left it off last time. So if you haven't listened to the first part, go ahead and listen to the first part. Stormtroopers of the fascist kind appear to match none of the normal permutations of the political struggle. Their very existence signifies that normal conditions no longer prevail. On the other hand, they do not form part of the state of open civil war either. Rather, political opponents of the government have become disagreeable to the authorities, but are not strong enough to pose the question of power in a frontal assault. The government and the ruling groups do not deploy the standard or regular state authorities against the opposition, but volunteer corps are recruited from the mass of the population to handle this job. They attack, ill-treat, or murder all persons who have become unpopular, destroy or plunder their property, and unleash a wave of persecution and terror calculated to drown all opposition. The activities of stormtroopers of the fascist type are in complete violation of the laws. Legally, the stormtroopers should be tried and sentenced to jail, but in fact, nothing of the sort happens to them. Their conviction in the courts is pure show. Either they do not serve their sentence, or they are soon pardoned. In this way, the ruling class shows its stormtrooper heroes how grateful and sympathetic it is. Now, under what conditions is the political activity of stormtroopers possible? In the more recent history of Europe, the pogroms conducted by the Black Hundreds in Russia in October 1905 form the first clear and significant example of this phenomenon, which is today so familiar to us. The first condition of their appearance is a complete disintegration of the normal state power. As a rule, the ruling class does all it can to strengthen the official authority of the state. In its view, the state forms an embodiment of the general public interest. The judiciary is an expression of impartial justice. Respect for the state and its authorities, belief in the power of law, is one of the strongest weapons in the hands of the ruling class. It is only when a country is totally shaken by a crisis of revolutionary proportions, and when the ruling groups can no longer hope to survive with the help of the law and police administration alone, that they begin to look around for other means. The government and the authorities themselves avoid any direct attack on the revolutionaries, Democrats, Socialists, and Jews, but one day the anger of the people explodes. The upright citizen who still believes in God, king, and country emerges, smashes the wicked rebels, and restores the power of legitimate authority. Yet if the anger of the people had been real, there would never have been a crisis. Thus the rage of the patriotic masses has to be manufactured. In October 1905, faced with a powerful revolutionary upsurge of the masses, the Russian government did not dare to assemble its police and Cossack forces and order them to liquidate the Jews and the Socialists. On the other hand, with police help, a popular movement of patriotic, anti-liberal, anti-Semitic nature was created, and these stormtroopers were then let loose on Jews and revolutionaries. In this way, a certain division of labor emerged. The Tsarist regime was not directly and officially responsible for the shameful actions of the pogrom's heroes. One could thus retain a certain distance, at least in the image projected back and in the press, even as many officials and police chiefs openly defended the Black Hundreds. On the other side, there were many straightforward conservative supporters of the Tsar, who wanted nothing to do with the pogroms. There were officials and even ministers who took a clear stand against the pogroms. Well, we definitely see that repeating itself. I mean, in the U.S., it's not that bad. The bloodshed has not been very great, but in other places it certainly has. I mean, from what you've told me, Tree, the situation in Brazil is far more dangerous than it is in the U.S. regarding that.
here it's more unveiled because the forces behind it don't care about the last example, the last sentence he made, right? There were officials opposed to it in the government. Well, certainly in the present era, the the things are so clownish, to be blunt, that the officials will support it openly and declare that, um, Afro Brazilians who live in the quilombos or the indigenous peoples who live in their uh, lands and whatever, the tribes, well, they don't deserve to. They have to be taken care of, as they would say. They are very blunt about what they want in power, and they don't care about like having two faces, being in contradiction with themselves. The point is like at the verge of of an even more genocidal prospect, I guess.
Hey, yep, the stuff is a lot more dire over there than it is here. And I think like the first like 30 seconds of your response I didn't get because for some reason my settings were I just noticed my settings were a bit off, but it's okay. Most of it got through. All right, let's continue. It is by no means necessary that at any given moment the entire ruling class has to accept the stormtroopers and their methods of struggle. As a rule, there will be differences of opinion. The liberal bourgeoisie and certain fastidiously authoritarian conservatives will condemn the stormtroopers and the methods of fascism, but it would be a disastrous mistake for the working class to suppose that such differences mean very much. Despite all tactical differences, the fascist stormtroopers belong with the ruling capitalists and feudal landlords as the flesh of their flesh. It is not true that in such periods there are three distinct forces in the state, ruling capitalists, fascists, and socialists who stand for democracy. Rather, there are only two forces, the capitalists and the fascists on one side, the Democrats and socialists on the other. One damaging drawback of the theory of a petty bourgeois fascism is that it obscures this simple fact in the eyes of workers. For then the world looks like this. First, there are the capitalists in power. Next, there is a petty bourgeois fascist opposition. Finally, there is a proletarian socialist opposition. With this threefold division, every conceivable trick and maneuver becomes possible. For example, an alliance of socialists with fascists against the ruling bourgeoisie, or a coalition of socialists with a liberal and upright conservative capitalist against a fascist, or some other soap bubble of this kind. Illusions of this sort have been disastrous for the working classes of Germany, Italy, and other countries. Yeah, I think that's definitely true. There's no way the fascists don't side with the capitalists, and there's no way the capitalists don't side with the fascists. At the end of the day, the capitalists much rather would side with the fascists than any socialist, just in principle. Because with the fascists, they still see themselves existing and remaining in some kind of power, whereas with socialists, they know that's not a possibility. In 1909, Trotsky wrote about the program Mobilizations of October 1905. For this crusade, the Russian government had enlisted its troops in every conceivable nook and cranny, from liquor joints to brothels. Here you saw the petty shopkeeper and the tramp, the Republican and his regulars, the house servant and the police spy, professional crooks and casual thieves, small craftsmen and brothel attendants, and the starving and intellectually desolate small peasant who had perhaps abandoned his home village only yesterday and whose head had been thoroughly confused by the din of factory machines. Initially, at the start of the Russo-Japanese War, the police had undertaken trial mobilizations of obscure masses, and they staged street demonstrations in favor of the government's war policy. Trotsky continues, from this time onwards, the consciously planned and organized mobilization of the scum of society witnessed an extraordinary development, and even if the greater mass of participants in the pogroms, if one can speak of mass here, remained a more or less fluctuating element, the core of this army was formed on a disciplined and organized military basis. This hardcore received its slogans and watchwords from above and passed them on into the ranks below. It was also this corps that decided the timing and the scale of any murderous action that had to be organized. Yep. I mean, like, his point here is, I think, important. The thing about, like, that fascism isn't some kind of, isn't really a totally organic movement at all. That, you know, there are strings being pulled from above to bring it into an actual organized force and to, you know, push forward its ideology, as well as just, you know, safeguard it from the consequences of illegal actions. I mean, in the U.S., for example, the whole Q shit brought so many people together, and like it was totally and very clearly a psyop. I don't know how people in that milieu don't realize it's a psyop when, I mean, what was it? The main thing that got people to believe in it is when that one person like literally posted a photo from like inside the White House.
Right.
You don't get to do that without the agencies approving it.
Something to that is like kind of like forgotten, or like maybe like in the accumulation of daily bullshit of news and stuff. Like people just, but like you remember it, and we were like there talking about it when there were mass mobilizations in last year, like March, June, July, and do you remember DC was literally on fire, or not really the city, but like surrounding the White House because there were mass protests around the White House and stuff, Washington and stuff. And the response at that point of the American state was literally a military style defense force. They put up such a defense of the White House or everything that it seemed like the United States was about to enter a war on its own soil. And from that to the January 6th, like it's very clear how the order from within was like, there is no, we're not gonna do anything. Let these people do it, right? Which is like the rise of Hitler. Of Hitler is much like that. Right? At every turn, like the German government does its best in quotation marks to stop the Nazis. And that amounts to doing pretty much nothing. Because it's not because they're unable or they're, you know, incapable of, but rather they have a position of alliance. And that's I think this is the point he makes very explicitly. It's like, of course, there's not going to be, in 1934 he's writing this, there's not going to be an alliance between fascists and socialists against the capitalists, because the fascists are already capitalists. They are already on the bourgeois side of things. They are of it. There's no imminent difference. No matter how much Gregor and Otto Strasser would like to claim. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, there is certainly despite the rhetoric, there is an actual on the ground identity shared in the groups, regardless of the rhetoric. Yeah, I mean, the thing about the Washington thing, right? How peculiar it was that, I mean, had this been a riot, you know, it would of the level of, or of the kind of like an actual leftist movement, there would have been, and like they had done what these right wing pseudo militias, you know, that have done, which is, you know, they literally broke into the Congress building and whatnot. There would have been a hell of a lot more blood had it been, you know, leftists doing that than the fact of these people, you know, just like, what is it, like 3 people died, that was it, and they died because they were idiots, but you know, anyone else would have done that on the left, and it's not going to happen. So anyways, continuing. Here it is sufficient to draw out only those features of the Russian pogroms and the Black Hundreds that are relevant to a history of fascism. The Black Hundreds prepared their actions by first circulating their newspaper in the localities they hit upon. This was soon followed by the experts turning up on the scene, sent there from other cities. Now the crucial rumors would start circulating. The Jews are planning an attack on all law-abiding Christians. The socialists have desecrated a holy image. The students have torn a picture of the Tsar to shreds. Then proscription lists would be posted up with the names of individuals and the homes earmarked for plunder and demolition on priority basis. On the notified day, the Black Hundreds would assemble initially at the churches for some special service. This would be followed by a procession of fluttering national flags, during the whole of which a military band would play patriotic tunes without interruption. Slowly the first window panes would be smashed, the first passers-by manhandled, then some shots would ring out, supposedly fired by the socialists or Jews on peace-loving national demonstrators. A cry for revenge would resound loudly at this point, and a mayhem of unrestrained looting, assault, and murder would then erupt. The police are there, but they remain passive and are in no position to defend the victims of the people's pogrom. But as soon as the Jews or the socialist workers mount an organized resistance, the police move into action immediately, and if they think it is required, even the army intervenes. Every attempt by workers to defend themselves is crushed and the pogrom can continue. In the autumn of 1905, the Black Hundreds committed some 4,000 murders in hundreds of Russian towns, to say nothing of all their other crimes. As far as its scale is concerned, this movement of the true Russian people is concerned will be compared with the more recent actions of the black shirts and brown shirts. At a time of enormous revolutionary tension, when millions of workers were on strike in Russia, when in innumerable villages there were peasant rebellions and the soldiers and sailors were starting to mutiny, it was still possible for the ruling class to enlist hundreds of thousands of impoverished elements as stormtroopers of the counter-revolution. Hatred of Jews as a stupid, fanatical nationalism, bribery, and alcohol all combined to draw together such masses of the petty bourgeoisie, lumpen proletariat, and occasionally even the right-wing workers. The possibility of stealing and plundering with total impunity drove hordes of professional criminals into the stormtroopers. However, there is an additional factor, the powerful temptation for all impoverished individuals who had come down in the world to join the stormtroopers. For as members of these fascist bands that were tolerated by the authorities, they were suddenly wrenched from being non-entities to becoming powerful elements in whose hands lay the fate of their fellow human beings. On this point, too, Trotsky writes with fine psychological insight. Now this man without shoes has become king. An hour ago he was a trembling slave, hounded by the police and by hunger. Now he feels like an absolute despot. He can do anything he likes. Everything will pass. He is master of life and death. If he feels the urge to do so, he throws an old woman from the window of the third floor to the pavements below. He smashes the skull of a baby with a chair. He rapes a small girl in front of a crowd of people. He shrinks from none of the tortures which only a brain driven mad with liquor and frenzy could contrive. For he can do anything he likes. Everything will pass. God bless the Tsar. Once the counter-revolution triumphed in Russia, the pogroms became unnecessary and the ruling class returned to law and order. But the Russian example shows us that a ruling class or a regime that can only keep itself alive through the terror spread by the stormtroops is finally doomed to extinction. The systematic destruction of all existing notions of justice, order, and legality that the pogroms and stormtroopers bring about is something no one can forget. The next revolutionary wave brings with it a ruthless collapse and retaliation. After that bloody autumn of 1905, Nicholas II was no longer Tsar of all Russians by God's grace. He was only the dirty little chieftain of the Black Hundreds. The heroes of the bygone pogroms could not save Tsarism. In no other European big power outside of Russia had the disintegration of state power prior to 1914 advanced to such a degree that the nationalist, anti-liberal movements would actually want to promote stormtrooper terrorism. It was the impact of the World War and the general social crisis that dominated its aftermath in Europe that finally secured renewed space for the methods of the pogrom.
Little comment. This section is probably like very. How many discussions have we seen about the lumpen during the Hyperion? And how many infuriated people have emerged from those discussions? And I think like this section would probably infuriate everybody, especially when he says the scum of society and so on,
Yeah.
citing Trotsky saying himself. But there is truthful to it. There is some truth to this, I think. And
Yeah,
it's
so-
the depressing condition, I guess, of capital.
Yeah, I mean, I've honestly seen very few people like put forth, let alone defend the notion that the lumpen proletariat could possibly be revolutionary. Because I think just in essence, in the very concept of it, that's not possible. Like to be lumpen is to be in a condition in which like you don't have class consciousness of the kind of somebody who's not moving within those circles. You don't have the same class commitments that you do. Like a lumpen proletariat has far closer commitments to the ideology of the capitalist than it does to the ideology of the proletariat.
I think it's something like also is that suffering doesn't make people good or nice. Like someone who is in the condition of being described as the scum of society had to be essentially excluded from it for, let's say, a brief period or a long period of time, to be denominated as such. For example, by this author. And it's nothing that someone is born as, with, and so on, but certainly inscribed through them, for them, into them, around their activity and condition, which revolves around the place where they are in society, in the social relation, in the sphere of social relations. And that's the problem, I think, about the suffering, is that no matter how much one has suffered in their life, it doesn't necessarily indicate that they will have a proper understanding, commitment, or even like perhaps objectives, that they will be certainly not evil.
Yeah, I mean, like, in going back to just the very concept of it, like, to be a lumpen proletariat is to be somebody who's moving on the underside of society, which is not operating within the regular bounds of civil law, in which, there has to be some kind of recognitive respect. No, these people function and work through regimes of violence. Like, how do you stake out, where your illegal business is holds a sway? Well, you literally kill people to let them know this is my turf, and it's your turf so long as you can protect it with your violence. Beyond that, nothing. And even if you're just somebody, oh well, I'm just a worker, I'm not the kingpin. Even these people end up just being forced into the violence themselves because it is their livelihood depends on it. It's like what people say: "Don't come between a man and his bread."
Yeah.
And I think the empirical fact, as well as the logical fact, is when you come between those people and their bread, they'll kill you.
Between those people and their stability.
Which is already almost non-existent.
Yeah.
Right? It's even worse
Right.
than just for someone who works at a factory or even a peasant or a farmer.
Yeah, if we're talking about them losing their livelihood, that would incline them towards class consciousness, but as it stands, they don't have class consciousness, and they're willing to defend the existing order, which provides them with, as we were talking the other day, dollar hamburgers or whatever,
Well, in their case, I just don't think there can be class conscious. Like what could be the at least in that world. I mean,
well, we're just talking about the lumpen proletariat, right?
yeah. I don't think there can be a class consciousness in the way that
well,
there can
everyone
be,
starts as a lumpen pro. you know.
Because what are you going to do? You can't form a union against the fucking kingpin.
No.
Like, that's not how it works. The whole system ends up being... you can't form in, like, institutions of recognition in that. Like, it's all bound up in regimes of violence. Like...
All right.
I mean, obviously, the biggest things is just, like, the drug trade and whatnot, but pretty much everything else is just also bound up in that. It's just who has turf, when, and where. All right, continuing to Italy. Throughout Europe at first, the World War signified a triumph of national authority. The parties of the pre-war period disappeared in the shadows of a civil truce. The censor took care to establish a complete unity of what the papers carried in of public opinion. Scientists, artists, associations, and groups were all, without exception, pressed into the service of the national cause. Above all, a wave of economic centralization swept through the countries of Europe as the war imposed its demands on the economy. Capital, organized in trusts, took over control of state policy, and those companies imposed their stranglehold over the production of whole branches of industry. All the belligerent big powers were now transformed into total states. It is easy to see that everywhere the anti-liberal nationalist tendencies gained the upper hand. In Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, at least in the early part of the war, the autocracy stood more solid than ever. In the coalition regimes that led the war effort, the conservatives in England and the parties of the right in France soon came to occupy the leading position. In Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, the key decisions that led to war were made by the ruling monarchs and their counselors, ministers, and general staff. The masses were not asked how they felt about the war. They simply had to obey and to show the expected national enthusiasm. In these circumstances, in July 1914, the big powers that lived under autocracies were under no compulsion to promote a policy of war by using nationalist mass hysteria. As for France, she had to put up with the war that Germany had declared on her. In England, finally, the House of Commons debated the question openly and decided in favor of war by a free vote. The course of development was quite different in Italy. Here, the regime itself and the majority of the people were initially in favor of neutrality, and it was only the nationalist mass movement that actually drove Italy into the war in 1915. The methods by which Italy was hustled into the war are of extraordinary interest. The Italian war movement of 1915, whose most popular leader already was Mussolini, is the historical link between the anti-liberal mass movements of the pre-war period and the fascism, strictly so-called, of the 1920s. The prospects of those who supported Italian involvement in the war appeared bleak in the autumn of 1914 and even early the following year. Italy's national interests could obviously be served just as well by preserving a stance of neutrality, as long as she could extract a good price for it from the belligerent powers. The socialist workers were for peace, so too were the Catholics and the traditional liberals. The great mass of the middle class and the rural population simply wanted to be left alone. They had no special yearning for blood-stained laurels. Even the large majority of professional officers were against this war because their sympathies lay with Germany, and they were quite reluctant to become involved in the side of the Entente. In spite of this, the big capitalists who were bent on imperialist expansion tied up with the younger intellectuals and succeeded in pushing Italy into war. Monarchy, government, and the parliamentary system had scarcely any weight in Italy, even when combined. The state apparatus was weak and no match for a stormy mass movement, even if the movement started only with a minority of the population. The events of 1915 and Mussolini's subsequent capture of power both have their roots in the peculiar history of Italy in the 19th century. The country was divided, economically and socially, into two parts, which, apart from their common Italian nationality, had little to do with each other. The north was dominated by a modern bourgeois culture, represented chiefly by the cities of Turin, Milan, and Genoa. In terms of education and economic activity, the provinces of the north were comparable to the countries of Central Europe. By contrast, in central and southern Italy, in the area previously controlled by the Church, and in the ex-kingdom of Naples, the prevailing relations were still almost medieval in character. Here, the mass of the population consisted of petty producers and impoverished peasants who could neither read nor write, and who were deeply sunk in superstition. The unification of Italy found its point of departure in the advanced north. But the great liberal statesman Cavour, who laid the cornerstone of Italian unification, intended originally to embrace only the northern provinces. He had no inclination to incorporate central and southern Italy directly into the unified state. Cavour was perfectly aware of that the north was in no position to be able to digest the south. However, the patriotic youth of Italy, full of bourgeois ideas of freedom and national greatness, cared nothing for Cavour's moderation. Cavour was prime minister of the North Italian state of Piedmont, which has been described as the Prussia of Italy. In fact, the small and weak political apparatus of Piedmont was scarcely comparable with the powerful war machine of Prussia. There is no battle of Königsgrätz or of Sedan in the history of Piedmont. The Piedmontese dynasty had won the royal throne of Italy, not through its military strength, but simply through skillful exploitation of the circumstances. When Bismarck founded his German Empire, the German bourgeoisie could rely on the enormous power of the Prussian army and the Hohenzollern autocracy. The Italian bourgeoisie could expect no help whatsoever from the Piedmontese dynasty and its officer corps. So the nationalist youth of Italy did not rely on the military services of Piedmont. On the contrary, they formed her volunteer corps, which moved into action independently to defeat the King of Naples and the Pope. In Garibaldi, his volunteer corps of red shirts found its perfect leader. In a celebrated campaign, Garibaldi threw the feudal monarchy of Naples in the rubbish heap. The red shirts had triumphed where the official national state of Piedmont had simply vacillated nervously. In a certain sense, one might say that Garibaldi's red shirts were the forerunners of Mussolini's black shirts. Yet one could never describe Garibaldi's following as fascist, for Garibaldi himself was a sincere national democrat, and his supporters never staged any pogroms. They never beat up defenseless people behind police protection. On the contrary, they enlisted voluntarily in the battle against Italy's foreign enemy. They took up the tasks before which the official national government of Italy shrank back. Garibaldi's red shirts were recruited from the best and most self-sacrificing section of the country's bourgeois youth. The Garibaldini were, of course, inspired enough to succeed in uprooting the feudal regimes of central and southern Italy, and could thus accomplish the country's unification. But they could not change the real social forces within Italy. 1870 represented the first stage in the national unification of Italy. But this Italy looked completely different from the one Garibaldi and his fighters had dreamed of. In the decades that followed, the bourgeoisie of the North proved incapable of assimilating the feudal South. The dominant social groups of the South were formed by the big landowners who ruled over an impoverished mass of small tenants, by the priests and by secret societies composed of corrupt political cliques. Milan and Turin were too weak to drain the marshlands of the mafia and Camorra. Meanwhile, in the last third of the 19th century, Italian history would witness not a dramatic struggle between North and South, but a wretched compromise. The so-called liberal politicians of the North reached an understanding with the ruling groups of the South. While the northern ministers left the South alone, the country south of Rome supplied them with a couple of hundred thoroughly pliant deputies to vote down any possible opposition. In the South, the traditional barbarism thus managed to survive. Whenever the half-starved and illiterate peasantry rebelled against the landlords, the gendarmerie of the liberal state intervened and shot them down. In the parliamentary elections, local authorities colluded with the landowners, but in Rome, the persons whom the masses elected in this way belonged to the liberal or even the radical camp. So Italy's parliamentary democracy was a dismal comedy, a mask for semi-feudal barbarism and repression. The first person to take charge of this new system was the Prime Minister Crispi, himself a southerner. His more intelligent successor, Giolitti, came from the north, it is true, but he dominated the southern machinery of voting and corruption with exemplary skill. Under these conditions, it is not difficult to see that the country's revenues were in the first instance used to finance purely local interests, that the state was incapable of pursuing a consistent policy aimed at cultural and economic development, and that, compared with the other big powers, Italy remained both poor and backward. In the period before the war, the Socialist Party of Italy fought courageously against these conditions in the general state of exploitation, but its base was formed by only a small minority of the population. It is also loud liberalism that Italy had got itself into scarcely appealed to the modern bit capitalists of Turin and Milan. They wanted an overhaul of the country that would enable her finally to catch up with the more advanced countries of the West. The young intelligentsia was likewise seething. Still immersed in the traditions of Garibaldi, they longed for a strong, superior, and prosperous Italy, and fought the politicians of the day. There was a whole host of patriotic youth organizations which were designed basically to help the unredeemed brothers, viz. Italian nationals who lived in Trento and Trieste under Austrian domination. When these young students became somewhat older and entered paid positions in the state bureaucracy, their nationalist fervor cooled down. However, the patriotic traditions of the Garibaldini that characterized the youth of Italy's upper classes survived and continued to penetrate newer generations at school and university. Sometimes out of disappointment with the shortcomings of the monarchy, this patriotic youth inclined towards republicanism. In the years leading up to the war, the rulers of Italy lived in a constant double fear. On the one hand, they feared the prospect of revolutionary action by the radical workers, syndicalists, anarchists, and socialists. On the other, the possibility of a putsch by the radical nationalists. Of course, the ruling groups enjoyed the confidence of the king and could rely on a parliamentary majority. But this hardly mattered, because the obedient electoral mass was composed of a stolid peasantry and petty bourgeoisie that could in any case never rush to the help of the government if any radical activist moved into action in the bigger cities. Moreover, it was doubtful whether one could rely completely on the troops themselves. These peculiar social conditions made it possible, precisely in Italy, for the imperialistic big bourgeoisie to appear in a certain sense, revolutionary. They made it possible for the ruling parties with their half-bourgeois, half-feudal support to declare war and for the people to be incited against Parliament and, if that came to that, against the king. As I said earlier, the growing weight of modern imperialism in Italian politics is clearly discernible in the decade before the World War. The outbreak of the World War formed the litmus test of the strength of imperialism in Italy. That was when the radical socialist Mussolini abandoned his old party and put himself at the head of the pro-war movement. In her biography of Mussolini, Margherita Sarfatti gives a vivid description of the mass movement that swept through Italy at the time. Down with Austria, and with Germany, and with Turkey, in their company. Bands of youth sang these lines arm in arm, with slow rhythmic passion in the resounding beat of marches. A strange instinct had united them in such serious, warlike discipline for the first time. These words formed the leitmotif of the interventionists, supporters of Italian intervention in the war. The interventionists overflowed through all the streets and piazzas of Milan, and slowly through this flood drained across the whole of Italy, embodiment of the inflexible will of a nation that would no longer tolerate limits to its heroism. The thick-set worker with fluttering scarf, the small, bespectacled government official who had outgrown his jacket, the lanky athletic student with his collars turned up. Now all of them lined up together as one fraternizing mass. They were the youth, pure and simple, the eternal youth idealists. It was these young elements from the factories and high schools, young in years and spirit, that the editor of Popolo d'Italia, Mussolini's new newspaper, hurled forth his summons with unerring instinct. They burned to make history, these young elements whom Mussolini later, in the years of nascent fascism, again gathered around himself with the cry, "A noi!" The radical socialist Mussolini.
Yeah.
If you discount its official fascist flourish, this description is a nice reflection of the ideology of the Italian war movement of 1915. Young intellectuals supported the war program of the big bourgeoisie because they longed to make history, that is, to establish through struggle both their own greatness and the greatness of the fatherland. Youth from the bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie, and to some extent even from the working class, managed to break loose from their own background. In the Italy of 1915, the so-called Garibaldi tradition exerted an especially confusing influence. One really did seem to stand before a struggle for fatherland and freedom, as the forefathers had in 1848-49 and 1859-60. The youthful fervor of the interventionists filled the streets of the major cities of Italy, assisted by the money of Italian capitalists and of the Entente. The din was so deafening that the liberal peace camp was forced into retreat despite the support of the Catholic Church and of the socialists. This is not the place to describe all the diplomatic maneuvering that preceded Italy's entry into the war. The foreign minister, Sonnino, personally an honest man, but a resolute imperialist, lobbied for war. Still, as late as the middle of May, Olgiati's influence seemed to have secured the prospect of peace once more. At that time, Mussolini wrote, "As for me, every day I become more firmly convinced than ever that the salvation of Italy demands that we shoot a dozen or so deputies. Shoot them in the back, I say, and throw up a couple ex-ministers into jail. I have become thoroughly convinced that Parliament in Italy is a plague boil that poisons the blood of the country. We have to cut it out. The honor and the future of our fatherland are in danger. The fatherland stands at the most terrible juncture in its history. People, the world lies with you, either war or a republic." The danger of peace breaking out soon passed, however, and the Italian imperialists saw their dream of war fulfilled towards the end of May. In Italy, this formed the first real triumph of those ideas in that class combination that would later be called fascist. Both the term fascist and an organization of fascists were already in existence in the movement of 1915. Mussolini founded a league of radical supporters of involvement in the war. Their individual local groupings were called Fasci di Azione Rivoluzionaria, combat groups for revolutionary action. However, in January 1915, they had only 5,000 members throughout Italy, and the pogrom-type stormtrooper tactics that would later characterize fascism had still to be developed. The first fasci confined their goals to dragging the country into the war. When that objective was achieved, they were dissolved. Only in 1919 was the fascist organization re-established. Mussolini went to the front as a war volunteer, but he and the other interventionists were destined to have quite remarkable experiences in the trenches. By this I mean not the usual hardships of soldiers in modern warfare, but disappointments of a quite different nature. In the editorial office, the popular mass meeting, the street demonstrations early in 1915, Mussolini had put himself at the head of enthused masses. But in the trenches, he and his political collaborators experienced the bitter hatred of the great mass of their fellows against the war instigators, and many active officers thought exactly like the men under them. Now it was time for the other side of the coin to show itself. In the demonstrations in the big cities, tens of thousands of impassioned young patriots could palm themselves off as the nation. But in the trenches they found the real people. The trenches had brought together the great masses from the countryside and small towns, as well as the organized working class of the big cities, and all of them hated the war. Mussolini's most enthusiastic collaborator in conducting war propaganda had been an ex-syndicalist, Filippo Corridoni. Corridoni had likewise gone to the front, but there he died. Mussolini later recounted how he got news of his friend's death. "I'd just knocked off from labor duty and was resting a while, when some chap came up to me and asked, 'Are you Mussolini?' I said, 'Yes.' 'Good,' said the other fellow. I have some good news for you. Corridoni was kicked in the butt. Serves him right if you ask me. To hell with all you interventionists."
No, kick to the bucket.
Oh, kicked in the bucket. There we go. As a people, the Italians are at least as brave, resolute, and self-respecting as the other peoples of Europe. The extraordinary mediocrity of the Italian army during the World War is therefore all the more remarkable. All the 3 whole years, the Italians still could not defeat a mere section of the Austrian army, and when some German divisions mounted an offensive, it entered a complete crisis and could only be propped up by urgently dispatched English and French auxiliary troops. The history of Italy's performance in the war only makes sense when you consider that the great majority of Italian soldiers hated the war and put up passive resistance to the army leadership. This example could be of great significance should any of the present-day fascist countries again become involved in war.
Huh? How prescient is this paragraph? The Second World War and Italy's blunders. Like, it's so prescient for me, at least.
While the Germans, French, and English entered the war of 1914 convinced that their very existence was at stake, and while in those countries at least 90% of the people consciously and firmly demanded involvement, Italy fought the war in a style that was already fascist. That is, the war was forced on its people by a noisy, well-organized minority. It is inevitable that a fascist state of war will be a state in crisis, because modern warfare can only be carried on with the cooperation of the entire people. In war, the fascist regime has to appeal precisely to people whom it has trampled underfoot, and it is bound to encounter their passive and later also their active resistance. The imperialist government of Italy, linked with the name of Sonnino, would have collapsed miserably in the winter of 1917-18 without the help given to it by the Allied powers. Thanks to the efforts of the American, British, and French bourgeoisies, Italy would likewise belong to the victorious camp at the close of 1918, and in the peace it obtained roughly the goals for which it had entered the conflict. But the Italian people were not happy with their victory. For 3.5 years they had suffered the absolute wretchedness of life in the trenches and deprivations at home. Now, on top of that, there was the mass unemployment bound up with the transition from a war economy to a peacetime economy. Italy's economic structure, inherently precarious, simply could not take the shattering blows of the crisis. The specter of inflation spread throughout the country, and impoverished masses watched as profiteers speculated shamelessly in currencies and commodities. In the year 1919, the overwhelming majority of the Italian people were filled with savage hatred against the policy of war and everything connected with it. In this question, workers, peasants, and the middle class all thought absolutely alike. The nationalist intoxication of 1915 passed into its hangover. True, Trento and Trieste had been forcibly taken and were now part of Italy, but what use was that compared with all the suffering and sacrifice that the people had to put up with? The mood in the country was such that the pro-imperialist faction lost its grip in the government machinery and the liberals of the pre-war period returned to power. Thus, the irrepressible Giolitti re-emerged from decline. When Mussolini went to the front in 1915, he had left behind the bluster of a triumphalist mass movement. When he returned with the rank of an under-officer, he was destined to obtain no higher position in the army, so great was the aversion of his superiors to the interventionists. He was alone and despised. In 1919, he continued to come out with his paper in Milan, but no one ever took him or his tendencies seriously at the time. The bitter hatred of the vast majority of Italians against the policy of war and against its instigators and beneficiaries produced an extraordinary strengthening of socialism. For the Socialist Party of Italy, the PSI, had consistently opposed Italian participation in the war, and in its aftermath its position appeared totally justified. In the elections of 1919, the Socialists won over 150 seats. The number of left voters was far greater than the size of the industrial working class in the country. Indeed, the very substantial part of the urban petty bourgeoisie came around to supporting the socialist movement, and something of even greater significance, possibly, socialism even gained a foothold among the peasantry and tenants of the South. Next to the socialist deputies in numbers came the representatives of a large democratic Catholic party, while the leftovers of the old liberal or conservative groups watched the future with anxiety. In the years of 1919-1920, Italy appeared to stand on the brink of a proletarian revolution. Proletarian Revolution. The PSI decided to join the Third International. Strikes and demonstrations were a daily occurrence. In hundreds of municipalities, the PSI won a majority and took over the local administration. The influence of the trade unions increased. Poor peasants no longer submitted to the authority of their landlords. The high point of this whole revolutionary movement was formed by the famous factory occupations in the autumn of 1920, when workers in all the major cities and industrial areas took over the factories and ran them for some time. In fact, if there had been a determined revolutionary party to unify the movements of the workers and the poor peasants, a successful proletarian revolution may well have occurred in Italy at the time. Such a party could have given the masses leadership in the decisive battles. Given the mood of the people and the extraordinary weakness of the so-called liberal government, the armed forces would not have put up any substantial resistance. However, the great majority of Italian socialists were not serious about revolution. They simply lacked the will. The working masses had no previous experience of revolutionary struggle, and most of their leaders had no idea what they should do in this critical conjuncture. Moreover, the socialist movement was internally disunited and torn by divisions, and in 1920 it dissolved into three distinct tendencies that engaged in sharp mutual fight. In this situation, the Italian socialists chose the worst possible course. They projected the appearance of being revolutionary without actually being so. They appeared radical enough to inject panic-stricken terror into the ruling and property classes, but they were not radical enough to deliver the really decisive blow. The 2 years of 1919 and 1920 passed without the socialists either taking power or doing anything of any significance. The revolution, however, is not something you can put into cold storage. When the proletariat let the most favorable period pass, it made itself the sacrificial lamb of its enemy. I mean,
sounds familiar.
This just highlights for me, the historical fact that there are revolutionary moments. Like, prior to that, it seems impossible. And then shit hits the fan. And then, literally due to the effects of material life, people become open to things which, before they were utterly opposed. Just simply because, of the failure of the promises of the capitalists or the fascists or whatever. Like, that's part of the deal of revolution. There's a total disillusionment with what has gone before, so people become very open to other ideas. Which also marks for me, like, why, it's important to have an ideological consistency, unlike certain people.
Well, yes. But who does? Honestly.
I mean, there are changes, but then there's still a certain consistency.
Yeah. Oh, I'm not talking about us. I'm talking about the public.
Talking about everybody.
I know.
And anybody with revolutionary aspirations.
Yes.
In March 1919, Mussolini had refounded the organization of the different fasci di combattimento that had existed in 1915. He began with a couple of hundred supporters. At that time, his radical nationalist program was about as unpopular as you could get. In the parliamentary elections of that year, the fascists suffered a complete rout. The mass of soldiers had returned from the front, full of bitterness against the war instigators, but the prevailing mood against the war, shared by the liberal government, sometimes took the wrong forms. Hardly any care was taken of those disabled in the war, and more generally, of those who had participated in the war. Sometimes it happened that officers were beaten up simply because they had uniforms on, or a furious popular mob would strip veterans of their decorations. None of this would have had much importance if the socialist revolution really had developed out of the revulsion against the war, But the revolution did not come, and the many thousands of now unemployed veterans felt neglected and betrayed. This was true both of the rank-and-file elements of the former army and of the demobilized officer corps, which felt completely deracinated. That's a new word for me. Slowly, in precisely these circles, the old activist nationalism now gained a new lease of life. However, its first prophet was not Mussolini, but the poet Gabriele D'Annunzio. Never heard of that name. Then again,
Really?
I've never done any studies in the history of this stuff, so a lot of it's new to me.
It's extremely famous.
He's the so-called Hegelian, somewhat, of the fascists.
Plato was right about the poets all along, is that it?
Yes. He's the one that, remember the last time we read, I mentioned the city of Fiume, the free city of Fiume. He's the one that proclaimed it. He occupied a city, Italian city, and he instituted a new government, people's government, literally, and turned into a republic, the free city of Fiume. And lasted not a lot, but it served as the embryonic form for Mussolini and the fascists, as how he conducted, or how him and his supporters conducted the form of government, the form of like institution, and so on, at the level of the city.
Yeah, and also declared himself Il Superuomo. He thought he was the fulfillment of the Übermensch. Hello?
Yes.
I don't know if that W cut out or not. Well, folks, that's the end of the reading, commenting. Fascism is a massive movement for today. See you next time.